Yeah. What are you more confident in? The revelation that aliens exist, or Bitcoin hits 100,000
Hmm.
in the next 3 years?
Uh, Bitcoin by a hair.
Wonderful. And fellow members of the tribe of asset capitalism, I'm coming from you today from St. Bart's. I am at Hendry_Hugh. Find me on Twitter or put on official to my name, Hugh Hendry Official, and be shocked at me in a bikini on Instagram. Or join us for the podcast show to see the actual thing on YouTube, Hugh Hendry Official, and of course on the Apple podcast. I don't have my collaborator. I don't have the alchemist at Wrights. Sweeney is, there's a rumor he's been held at the airport. I'm sure that's not true, but he is traveling back from Canada to the United Kingdom. So he has left the heavy burden of replacing his levity falls on my shoulders. Let me just remind you for the new listeners, I ran a hedge fund. I ran a macro hedge fund between 2002 and 2017, which is to say I achieved tenure. And if you're trying to work out how much money I made bits and pieces. My superpower was I didn't correlate. I didn't fit in. I created a uniquely uncorrelated asset until that world just became gray. Since 2017, I've been living in St. Bart's. I've been doing a lot of soft focus. I've been doing a lot of brain repair, and I've been doing a lot of speculation in property. But my mind, I find, is repaired, and it's now curious and it's playful again. And that's why we have this show. And to that end, I am delighted to say that we have Matthew Pints on the show. And Matthew's someone I've been following on Twitter. And I think I don't know if he's Matthew, I don't know if he's Jason Bourne, or I don't know if he's been engaged in tracking down Jason Bourne. But Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And, come on, answer the question. Are you Jason Bourne, or are you responsible for tracking him down?
No, I'm just a, middle manager. I just push the papers around, and the cool cats go run around the world and blow stuff up. But no, I'm a consultant, which in the DC parlance means nothing and everything. I spent about 10 years helping government think through just bad scenarios, to say kind of at a high level what I did. And after doing that, most focus on government work. Just in the past few months, I've shifted mostly to the private sector. So I joined a startup focused on advising multinationals on cybersecurity and geopolitical risk. So we can get into all and any of that.
So to people of a certain age and persuasion, War Games is a movie with a kid who is on the verge of starting World War III. What is the modern take on a war game? And I think of my experience again. I have to commit. I have to commit a disclosure. I studied. One subject was market-based accounting research, which is, except I was using a data stream terminal, a price feed, and I wouldn't call it a war game, but I was testing a hypothesis onto a kind of living body of emotion and ripples of feeling and knowledge. And I was kind of testing whether markets how they would react, let's say, to an accounting release, which had no impact on cash flow. Mm-hmm. And in theory, there should be no impact, even if the optical earnings are inflated or brought down. Mm-hmm. And I'm testing the opposite. And so that, a little bit like security, where you're examining, you're waiting for the phantom to reveal it. You've got a theory that the phantom will reveal itself. And then when it happens, I was full of wonder. And I thought, that was my hook. Do you have a similar experience?
Yes, and there's quite a well-developed methodology in the government for how to think through these different types of analysis. And they really, in my mind, fall into two general buckets. for different classes of problems. For a certain class of problems, I think maybe in the financial world you're more familiar with, that lend themselves to detailed modeling and simulation, where you can construct a reasonable theoretical model of the phenomenon. You can sort of identify the relevant variables, collect data on those variables, plug them into the model, and run different simulations, Monte Carlo simulations, a whole different range of simulations. You can sort of tune, the what if input outputs, and that's a really useful mechanism for certain domains and problem sets that lend themselves to some first order modeling and simulation. And so I've done some of that. That's a useful methodology. I did a lot more though in the sort of what you could call just sort of scenario analysis, where the domain of interest is so unknown, you have very little empirical data to plug into the model, and the phenomenon you're trying to understand has maybe never happened before, right? Like all-out nuclear war, right? And so, or large-scale disasters, and so you can't necessarily look for empirical back testing, do statistical models, and where you're running essentially your intuitions against a certain degree of just so stories. And so that's a lot of what it is constructing a plausible enough distribution of scenarios that capture almost artificially sort of different ways the world could be, that you're really interested in testing some other aspect of the government. So you're not actually necessarily trying to predict what's going to happen. You're trying to run a simulation and then see how you're going to respond, whether as a government agency, whether as a set of senior leaders making decisions. And so a lot of it is not necessarily trying to run the predictive model, but get enough of the details plausible enough to then facilitate a realistic discussion or simulation of your decision making, and do that to scale.
So it's like kind of national security risk management. You're rehearsing imagined realities so that should they happen, you actually go, okay, we're prepared. Okay, so we're going to go X, Y, Z comes up like that. Yeah.
That's the idea. Yeah, the idea is to try to simulate it in a realistic manner, and there's degrees of that, and scale and cost, trade-offs. Where every 2 years, for example, the government does a national level full-scale exercise, and these are planned for basically the 2 years up until they do one, and they do the next 2 years of planning. And those are the biggest, most expensive. They involve thousands of people across many government agencies, and they try to pick, big scenarios that would have like national strategic relevance. And there's a lot of play at all levels, up to and including the National Security Council, Principals Committee, the President, et cetera, all the way down.
How much do they spend on those models?
It is probably, if you added it up across all the government agencies, probably tens of millions of dollars. It's a big coordination mess because it's. I know those
scenarios changing. Forgive me, but like every 2 years. I would imagine if like 2 years is not a huge span of time. Do you find that if effectively the scenario is an updated scenario from 2 years ago with the knowledge that's passed, or is it evolving and capturing, like, to what degree is there evolution over 2 years?
That's actually been a thing that I've been I tried to do a lot when I was sort of in the thick of that, was to make the choice of scenario and the design of the subsequent scenarios build on the previous ones in like a more coherent way. The problem is it's a big political thing, because every agency and even senior leadership has their own particular thing they want to look at. And there could be completely different people in 2 years. And so I've seen in practice, it's a lot less continuous evolutionary iteration and a lot more, what's the fancy new problem that we're going to make the next 2 year thing look at? And so usually at the smaller scale within a particular agency, there is a lot more continuous evolution and like application of lessons learned from the previous version. But at these national level ones, it's very political, and it's harder to pull that all together.
And so everyone is asking me, can you mention a scenario? I mean, can you kind of take us into that world?
Yeah. So, for example, I was the lead evaluator for the 2016 capstone national exercise. And, it was done at an unclassified level, at a secret level, and at a top secret SCI level, which is like compartmented squirrel stuff. So I can't talk about the secret or the top secret stuff. The unclassified portion of the exercise was essentially, a bunch of bad guys have some nukes, and they're trying to get into the country. And, we're practicing basically how we would find and stop them. And then we sort of jump ahead and assume we didn't stop them. And there's a boom in DC. And then we have to respond post-boom as a government, that has now been forced to go to alternate locations. And so there's a whole series of play basically over like 2 weeks, with everyone from the government doing their specific aspects of that problem. And then my job is to evaluate it, right? So that's the thing is like, understanding and interviewing and collecting data and understanding what those problems are. And the government's a big, complicated, messy beast. And these sorts of extreme scenarios are where you're really putting to the test how well they can talk and coordinate with each other in situations of extreme, circumstance. And how can they come to a consensus? And if they had a plan for A and a plan for B, but now all of a sudden A and B happen at the same time, did plan A and plan B, take that into account? And it turns out actually maybe they didn't. And maybe plan A says something different than plan B, and you've got to now rewrite those plans. And so that's basically, what I did. And so that's one. Did ones on, more like ho-hum things. So I led evaluation of not just exercise, but like real world events. So for like big hurricanes we've had, like Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Irma, Maria.
I know all about Irma.
Hurricane Harvey. So
yeah, if you got any scenario analysis for this season's cyclonic hurricane situation, because I'm almost ready with my second house, and I'm praying that we don't get another big bad one.
I think Europe is also praying with the LNG terminals. So yeah, I think there's right now the median forecast is 21, major hurricanes. It's relatively high. And that's the thing is, my experience doing this stuff for the government is you have these extreme tail risk scenarios that we've never seen before, right? Like a nuke going off in DC. But it's so extreme and the consequences are so high, you have to like plan for it and do the rehearsals. But on the other end of the spectrum, we get hurricanes every year. And we know like those are very destructive. We know the impacts that those have. And so the government is always trying to balance how much do we try to prepare and invest in the known, high probability and sort of moderate consequence scenarios, but without ignoring these tail risks that if they do happen, like big and bad things happen.
Is it a scenario where you just watch Netflix and like reading a book? I feel like some of those scenarios I've watched on Netflix, and you let the creatives solve it for you. Do you know what I mean? Which is silly, but there's something about the unconscious REM that when you're subject to, resting, let's say, that you go, wow, and you get an insight. You find that?
And this is the problem with the way these scenarios are generated is it's subject to a very long and complicated bureaucratic process. And so you start with that imaginary creative template, and then it has to go through a number of bureaucratic filters and leadership decision making. And, as in any bureaucratic process, right, like the out of the box kind of squirrely ideas tend to get filtered out first. It's like, oh, that's good, but we're not going to spend $5 million looking at that, right? Like maybe write a white paper or send some guy, in RAND to like chase it for 6 months. But we're not going to spin up all these people to look at that.
But Matthew, isn't that it? Like the greatest vulnerability to these systems is the power of creativity. Like creativity you have to be courageous because you have to take on. You have to be different. You have to like take on like, oh, come on, like my hedge fund was profoundly uncorrelated because I always, my mantra was, how do I compete against the world's smartest people, right? And I thought to myself, it would be suboptimal to try and outsmart the smartest people. And so instead I went for creativity and I said, why is it that smart people are not guaranteed to succeed? And so I would kind of think, I was the guy when life is capricious. So how you build capriciousness into a model, because that's what I was trying to do. I was like you, attempting the fallacy, the absurdity of imagining tomorrow. And tell me, are you like how do you get creative into that system? I think someone once said if you're rigidly sticking to the plan you made last night, then today and what happens today is going to demolish you.
Yeah, and I've done I've had there's like the formal professional work, and then there's like the after work conversations, right? And especially this comes up in the intelligence world where, ever since 9/11, there's been this sort of hyper conscious anxiety about strategic surprise, about missing the forest and the trees, not seeing, that unlikely event that you could have put together if you had the right pieces of the puzzle, but you didn't have the right frame of mind to think differently enough to then conceive of that scenario in the first place. And this is sort of the inherent, somewhat trap of, so the United States government has so much intelligence. Like we have like the Eye of Sauron, right? Like we don't miss anything, but that doesn't mean we understand it all. That doesn't mean we can make sense of it all. And that doesn't mean that we understand the implications of what we're seeing, even if we think we understand it. And so there's so much like bureaucratic energy and money and effort to just build the collection platforms, but then it all gets funneled to a human brain at some point. And the human brain has to make sense of it, and then to consider the implications of it for senior leadership, for decision makers. And everyone has to do that kind of basic, it's like a basic like biological function. You have sense organs, and evolution has primed us to develop sense organs to make sure we don't die, right? And eat the wrong thing and fall into a ditch or whatever. And so like our human nervous system is an intelligence collection system and analysis system to guide action. And it was evolutionarily conditioned. And you can think of the national security structure in the United States and any government as subject to the same sort of evolutionary pressures. But really, they don't get as much sort of direct feedback, and they haven't existed on a long enough time scale as like human beings or any other animal to like go through many iterations of like natural selection. The major point of natural selection that drove a certain structure is World War II. And it was that existential conflict on a global scale that selected for vertically integrated state-directed structures of intelligence, military, and other sort of economic instruments of national power, and arrange those instruments of national power in bureaucratic control structures as like vertically integrated departments and agencies. Like that was what we built after World War II. And that's like what we're stuck with now. And the problem is the world is changing, and the nature of the conflicts, the nature of the problems are very different than the nature of the conflicts and problems that those structures were built for, and they're struggling to adapt. And I think that's sort of my sort of core intellectual observation about the mismatch to a certain extent.
Yeah, the organizational mismatch. Now, you said earlier with the scenario, the nuke, and I wonder if there's a latency bias in the sense that kids in America go to school today and they watch videos about what happens if a shooter comes in, and you've got a procedure going under the desk. In the 1960s, that scenario was a nuclear bomb goes off and you go under the desk. It's amazing how like you say, our problems have gone from macro, the bomb, to the micro crazy person that causes havoc. Can I ask, what did the models? Can you say anything? What did the models? What did they suggest stock market reaction? So I'm saying to you that probably at some point, unfortunately, we will suffer a nuclear, like an attack. It won't destroy the planet, but like the Second World War killed, help me here, 200 million people. Ballpark, ballpark. And I think for sure we'll get another kind of crisis which leads to that profound loss of human life. And of course we're looking at Ukraine and Russia and the encirclement of NATO and it's elevating. It's not coming down. So because I need to know how your model works with regards to like what your model, how your model thinks I would react to that scenario.
Yes. And you're really touching on what I think is the most difficult piece for the government to understand is the government is usually better at modeling like the day-to-day stuff to keep the lights on, to keep the DMV running, to keep the checks cut. They do that, And then they consider like the existential, like worst case scenario, where they could care less what the stock market's doing. And they just need to have a functioning system to keep food and water and shelter provided to people. But it's in that regime of like, so like, for example, to go back to the Cold War, that really meant there was a big separation between, say, emergency management as a discipline for like, you know, cutting checks after a hurricane floods your basement, and what's called continuity of government, which is like nuclear war. And we need to make sure we can have the, you know, national critical functions still perform. And one of those national critical functions is identified as like, you know, economic functions. And there's like sub functions for that, you know, in the traditional bureaucratic model are like Treasury has responsibility for, you know, debt service and debt payment, and the, you know, and with the primary dealers and making sure that their backup plans and their backup servers are protected. The Fed has its own responsibility for sure dollar clearance is well preserved, that they have their own continuity systems, and that, you know, the financial services industry is now considered critical infrastructure. And so we have an entirely new.
It's a bit like if the theater burns down, we got to make sure we've got an alternative electrical source so that I can continue to play my bass guitar. And it's like, well, but why? The theater's burnt down, the audience are dead, and you're quibbling about like still delivering your daily function. It seems kind of a little bit.
There is some, if you really dig into continuity of government planning, which I did a lot of, and it's all really classified, so I can't go into the details, but you start to get into these somewhat absurd scenarios where, you know, what world are you living in that people care about that thing? But you have to write the plan for it because you're not in that world, and so you're going to do it. But I think in general, they're mostly concerned not with like asset prices per se, or like what the hedge fund guy is going to do, but is there a just basic functioning economic system? Is there enough of a market remaining that they could reconstitute it as part of a recovery process? And then, you know, preserve enough of the basic communications infrastructure, core entities that have, systemic roles in that system, that they have identified backup plans, continuity plans, assets that they can devolve to, people that have proper training, all that sort of stuff.
Because I really welcome this exchange, because in my career, I didn't tune in to geopolitical. I was playful and curious, and I used, I think the key to creativity is relaxing the brain. And I never found geopolitics relax my brain. I think Einstein played the violin,
Yeah.
I think Beethoven walked around the woods of Vienna, This year, I'm so tuned into the geopolitical because I was having lunch with like one of my great intellectual market friends. And it's funny because he has connections with security where they're one arm of security is curious about the minds of people like myself and my buddy, and how we would react and what our expectation and what the probabilities are. And so they kind of share, and they had shared this kind of their Taiwanese, was he in Taiwan? Or he's in Singapore. And this guy is their go-to China guy. Everything, his track record, he's really high. Yeah. So you have to listen. And he's putting out that the probability of China invading Taiwan is profoundly high. Palantir, which is bringing kind of modern technology, or bringing credit card, trying to find the needle, which again makes sense. I think they're up at 30% for, again, not necessarily China Taiwan, but a profound escalation. Now, when he told me that, I would typically have that in such a low probability that it really wouldn't influence my behavior. But when he told me that, I kind of went to like 20% or so, which is insane. And the reasoning is that we are so embedded we are them, they are us. And they are they are the global economy. We are, but like we're joined at the hip, that we could choose a different form of warfare with Russia because it was 2% of GDP for the world. And we could make we could bring it down. With China, we can't do that. And if China were to wait 50, we've woken up and we get that codependency. But and then the next 15 years, we're going to, I think, unwind this globalization so that we're not as acutely vulnerable. But presently, we'll never be more vulnerable to China going rogue. Please give me your views.
Yes. So I'll start first by assessing how I assess the sort of probability estimates themselves. And it's because there's a reason why your friend was approached by, I think I know the certain division of a certain intelligence agency that does that, is because that intelligence agency has had their China network severely limited. And this has been publicly reported over the past number of years that, a number of the most important, human intelligence collection networks inside China were rolled up, were destroyed. And the actual explanation for why that happened is a combination of both moles, right? A number of CIA officers flipped to the Chinese and gave away their assets, but also just basic bureaucratic hubris. A number of intelligence officers that got their training in Iraq and were using a device that's usually for covert communications. Essentially, it was an app that could be downloaded on a phone, and it was like the Battlefield version. That's like the lower quality version for like when you've got a guy who you just recruit to tell you when a certain guy walks down the street. You're not going to give him like the really good, like spy stuff. But they like became so used to using that app that that contractors stuff, they brought it with them to China. And let's say operating in Iraq is a very different hostile intelligence dynamic than operating in Beijing and other parts of China. And it got cracked, and a lot of several dozen intelligence assets inside China got popped, including a guy who got executed on the CCTV camera in front of everyone else in that office. And so so compare that to say what we were manifestly showing to the world in the lead up to Putin's invasion, where we had very good intelligence, and we were making that intelligence public about our assessment of the likelihood of Putin going into Ukraine and using that intelligence to disclose, information operations and false flags, all sorts of stuff. We do not have that, as far as I understand, as much in China, right? If we do, it's like super, super crown jewelsy stuff. No one would know, right? But in general, we just don't have as much of an insight into senior leadership thinking inside China. In particular, the nature of their decision-making process is so concentrated in Xi himself that we really struggle to make an assessment of what his decision-making is going to be. Unlike in previous Chinese administrations, there was some devolution of decision-making and power in the Politburo and the Standing Committee, and they all had these discussions inside their sort of working level sessions. And, all you needed to have is some little bird to tell you what was said, and you can sort of piece together where the potential moves and policy are going to be. Right now with Xi, it's very difficult. He makes these decisions himself. And so it's very hard to make that assessment of like, what's he going to do? So that's why
why don't you try? Give us your interpretation. How would you piece it together? Reveal your logical construction.
So the basic problem that Xi has, but it's also the strategic objective he set for himself, is the program of national rejuvenation, which includes reunification of Taiwan. And they've set for themselves specific milestone markers for that, as well as overall sort of CCP development of the country that have like 2025, 2035, 2040. And so 2040 is like the line in the sand for like their centennial anniversary, where they want to be basically a great power on par with the United States, where they've carved out a sphere of influence equivalent to ours, where the Pacific is like their Monroe Doctrine, et cetera. They have dominance in the first to the second island chain. The Indian Ocean is, where they can have the Blue Water Navy that they're building go through it. So they see it as kicking us out as interlopers in their backyard, getting essentially back to the status that they felt they lost through the ravages of, colonization and the opium wars and et cetera. So that's like the mentality that he has programmed into his population and a certain set of expectations that he's laid out as like conditions of the party of the party's legitimacy. So they have to do something at some point to make good on those promises. So I think they will do something eventually. The question is, do they try to do the slow salami slicing, co-optation, economic absorption of Taiwan, where they have linguistic ties, economic ties, like China's basic MO for the past 20 years has just been using money and influence and, traditional espionage and subversion operations.
Notion of the power of now, again, like a security assessment that says, if I was them, this is my best shot because we're weak.
The window for me is in, well, one thing, Xi is getting old and he's not very healthy. So he's got his own personal clock.
What age is he?
He's 68, I think. But he's had some reported health issues, maybe an aneurysm or something related to like a carotid artery blockage, which is very common in older Chinese men. They don't have very healthy lifestyles, bad pollution, etc. But yes, so the way they're trying to think in terms of this relative power differential. Like the reason why Dalio puts those charts in, Dalio talks to the Chinese all the time. Like Dalio is kind of a half Chinese guy in terms of the way he thinks strategically. And he's adopting some of their frame and he's also kind of translating it to the wider audience. But they see like relative power lines and they know that they have really poor demographics. They know they're going to get trapped in the sort of middle income trap. They're trying to sort of jump ahead up the value chain and number like strategically identified industries, but they're trying to race against time, basically. They have about 30 million extra men that they want to get rid of, and a war is a good way to get rid of that. And they see sort of the power mismatch in the South Pacific is, in particular, if it's going to be a naval battle, is their dominance in shipbuilding capacity relative to ours, where it's going to take us at least a decade to, like, if we really did a crash national force and like we need to like rebuild our ability to make ships, it's going to take us at least a decade. And so they're really hitting the inflection point in terms of shipbuilding, in terms of their missile construction, and the missiles they can basically just rain hellfire on Taiwan. So the question for me strategically is what happens in the next 2 years is also subject to their assessment of U.S. internal political dynamics. And so for me, the danger zone in particular is going to be the lead up to our national election in 2024. I don't think he's going to do anything next year because I think he still needs to get sort of COVID underway and to get their vaccines rolled out, the mRNA ones. Once he gets his third term, he's going to solidify power, and then he can sort of, basically put that plan in motion, which takes a long time. So if you're going to do this, large scale,
I can relax this year.
I don't think it's going to happen this year. I really don't. I don't. I mean,
here's a question: if it did happen, what? Describe, so it happens, right? We wake up tomorrow and boom, the theater is open. What happens? Like, what's your interpretation of what markets do? What's your interpretation of the security response from the US?
So this is where maybe I'm on the cynical side, and I have a colleague of mine who's a China expert, speaks fluent Mandarin, has studied like their cyber operations, and we've had these conversations just sort of on the side. And, everyone is guessing. But honestly, like the way the Chinese would likely prosecute that conflict would be very different. They're learning a lot of lessons from Russia. And they know like the things they would definitely want to avoid would be like would be to have like this sort of propaganda, videos and TikTok of like their invasion. So the first thing they do was just cut off the island entirely. They would do cable cuts to the entire island. They would jam the satellites. It'd just be a black box. So the Western average citizen would have really no idea other than like third-party reports and what the U.S. government is saying about what's happening there. China has very sophisticated information operation capabilities. They would send out their own narrative, but there wouldn't be the sort of ground truth to sort of conflict. And so you would need to have a precipitating like event that could sear in the minds of the American public consciousness, like enough of like the emotional register to say, yes, we can send our Pacific fleet in there. We're going to go to war. I think they want to make it like a fait accompli. Oh, the lights just went off in Taiwan. Oh, like the internet's out. Oh, and by the way, like we're just putting all of our ships in a de facto blockade around Taiwan. We're not landing, thousands of troops and blowing stuff up yet, but we're saying it's ours and back off. And then challenging Biden, potentially an election year where he may or may not be running, to to basically try to bring the country to war without like that obvious Pearl Harbor moment. And I think if they play their cards right, they could do that in a way where the average American just sort of shrugs and says, well, why would we go to war to turn the lights back on in Taiwan? So I think it's a coin flip. It depends on leadership. It depends on whether the Chinese miscalculate, and if they just like commit atrocities and those images are broadcast to the world, then U.S. government is going to be forced to lead. I mean, that's I think the major lesson from Russia is that so much of the national level strategic decision making wasn't just like pure realpolitik. It was also wagged by the social media tail of, like, for example, sanctions was the thing that surprised them, where when they put the sanctions on Russia, that like first weekend, they explicitly carved out energy, and the Treasury Department put like a helpful infographic to the energy companies and all the other sort of associated trading firms and banks to say, here's how you can continue to buy energy from Russia, and here's like how you can keep your business operations that are not sanctioned running. Please, wink, wink, please do that. And then instead, like the sort of self-sanctioning wave where it just became morally untenable to keep your business operating in Russia just sort of flipped like a domino. And then they all had to back out. China looked at that and they're strategizing on that point, how to prevent that from happening, how to prevent like that sort of corporate, mob decision-making to sort of flee. And they're trying to calibrate, and they're basically trying to make that irrelevant by just copying their technology and squeezing them out of business anyways, which has been their...
As I understand it, a profound amount of the fluctuation of Russian naval exercises where they flirt with, the sovereign line where demarcation in the sea, especially with the United Kingdom. Like if you were to do a scatter diagram, there would be an intensity of activity essentially around the fiber connection linking Europe with the United States. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And can I ask, what happens, or how is it classified if Russia were to take essentially the internet down? That they said that, if they, and just now you can't say they're losing. It's messy. It's messy, right? But let's say it was clearly going against them. And the final thing is some awful kind of limited nuclear response. But before you're there, you take that internet down. In terms of international law and stuff, I mean, profoundly devastating, yeah? But who's the policeman for that? What happens in that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of government planning and contingency planning for cable cuts as an instrument of sort of asymmetric, deniable, sub-threshold conflict is sort of the term, right? So
why do you think they haven't done it, first of all? And what's the escalation to take you to that point?
So there's been a lot of debates, internal to the government and external to the government, about cable cuts, but also in the broader landscape of, you call it like cyber physical attacks, right? So that is one example of sort of cyber physical attack, right? Where your objective is to compromise your adversary's digital infrastructure. And you can do that via, or accomplish an effect on your adversary's domestic physical infrastructure, but using cyber as the means of inflicting that damage, right? So if Russia was to fly over a bomber and attack like the Freeport liquid natural gas facility, cause a spell eye, go to war, right? If they hack one of the controllers that controls the overpressure in one of those valves, and just like with Stuxnet, it overpressure and explodes and takes down that facility for the rest of the year, and now whatever it is, 15% of exports to Europe get turned off. Is that an act of war? As of now, we don't have the codified.
Hasn't that happened? Isn't there a very important LNG?
Yeah. So that, I mean, I'm not saying Russia did it. I'm not saying Russia did it at all. I'm just saying hypothetically, like that happened. Yeah. The overpressure happened in the pipe. Freeport got taken down. They've been running at sort of. They've been running very hot, and they haven't done as much maintenance, so accidents happen, right? But that's an example of a sub-threshold, cyber-enabled physical disruption. That's sabotage, essentially. That's a form of asymmetric retaliation that we would expect Russia to engage in post our sanctions and our covert, if not overt, support for Ukrainians and killing Russians, right? Where that goes specifically with cable cuts, it kind of depends, because you can cut a single cable and it's like a message. And actually, they've cut cables before. I think there was a Norwegian cable that was cut 2 years ago. Every once in a while, the Russians would go around and will just sort of snip a cable. And yeah, it's not
Touch
like an
ball plates. I wonder, that's curiosity. What if it's like that's playfulness, which is a form of creativity.
Yeah, and they're constantly trying to test their limits, test the boundaries, and force us to draw their line in the sand and call our bluff on that line in the sand. And so to me, it's really, I mean, you can play this out, right? If they cut like several cables to the point where like global markets get disrupted, and it's like and it's not just cut in one place. They're like, you can like there's different variations of cable cuts. You can like do like the nuisance cut, and then a repair ship can come by, drop a sleeve and fix it in a few days. And it's like, all right, whatever. Internet is somewhat self-healing. But it's the internet is a network where it's like a nonlinear response. Like if you do one or two little cuts, the overall network, it can reroute. But if you cut enough of them, the network breaks. And that's where it goes from being like a nuisance, covert, asymmetric retaliation to like, it's an attack on global infrastructure. The U.S. economic model is now going to be severely damaged. That would then be a whole other level of decision making at like National Security Council. Okay, what are we going to do here? Like, do we now bring down the entire Russian internet as a retaliation? And there's a lot of the back and forth of like, if you do this, this is what we're going to do. And that's where I, like, broadly speaking, what I worry about is we're in this sort of slow motion World War III, where everyone knows because we have nukes, like no one wants to go to that end of the spectrum, but there is a global contest for power in a sphere of, and to sort of, challenge Western hegemony to sort of across all fronts, trade, economics, actual geographic borders, to try to reset the terms of international relations in the view of what these Eurasian autocrats and their authoritarian systems see as a system balanced against them, that's sort of extracting them, taking their resources and giving them pieces of paper.
You have to explore lots of other infiltrations and mini disasters to keep you away from the big one.
Yeah, and so you can see this sort of just like grind of like a Cold War with a bunch of these proxy escalation points where everyone doesn't really want to kill each other. And China, to your earlier point, this is the key decision, is like, their economic model was built on globalization, right? Like they wouldn't have brought this 500 million people out of poverty if it weren't for globalization and US financial capital pouring into their country and essentially bringing them into this Eurodollar recycling system that we built since World War II of, US runs a permanent or structural trade deficit to a certain extent, at least post the 70s, really. And as a consequence, which
is a generous gift to the rest of the world, because it essentially it's willing to receive the surplus savings of everyone else, even though it doesn't need them. And actually, increasingly, I think it's becoming a huge national security issue because it's leading to the impoverishment, and I think it's leading to a kind of a form of serfdom. The US is a serf in terms of its willingness to accept surplus savings in order that other countries have current account surpluses. But what came to mind, and really it's sparking now. I'm my coffee's kicking in. The US and its partners, the free world, launched an explicit economic war against Russia. Why does Russia not retaliate economically? Because we're at a point of profound vulnerability in that I think last summer, US assets reached 7 times GDP, which is like just off the charts. Yeah. And there's a responsibility for the Fed there and for others, right? And if you bring that down to like 3 times GDP or less, I mean, the US ain't so strong. You mark the card, so it's not a nuclear escalation, but like you target all those hubs and spokes for the web that keeps global markets alive. You take them down. You're like, hey, you cut us off, we're cutting you off. That seems reasonable, but devastating.
I don't have a straight answer, but I think I have like reasoned hypotheses. One is I think Putin's still, I think, strategic objectives is to break the EU first. So I don't think his strategic objective is necessarily to jump straight to a new global order, like in one fell swoop. I think his near-term immediate strategic objective, which is in his mind critical to that larger geopolitical reordering, is to break the EU. And to a certain extent, that's what he's trying to do. And that is really using gas as a weapon, trying to divide the Europeans, force them to basically choose between their domestic industry in Germany and other European countries, Italian bonds, and the currency and the political and economic union. And to like force them to make a choice and to see what they decide to do, right? And to create so much political friction inside Europe that they just collapse as a power block that can counter him. That's like his ultimate objective. And I think that's like he's really risking, though, because by making this action, he's, at least in the near term, unified the EU and brought the United States more into Europe and expanding NATO, more military support, more economic support, et cetera. The question is, how long can that last? And so it's a game of endurance. Who can feel the most pain? And so his near-term objective is get to the summer, through the fall, force them to spend down their gas reserves. If they have a hot summer, it's going to be really problematic for them. And then the winter comes and they're freezing. And LNG from the United States can only backfill some of that. So that's like near-term strategic objective. Why his focus is on Europe and not
the success. Sorry, but the success of that objective, I've got to just keep forgive me. The success of Putin's plan can actually be calibrated by the euro dollar, the level of the euro. Putin's plan is euro should trade at like 80. Yeah, it should trade at 80 owing to the profound lack of leadership previously with Europe. You lose your sovereignty when you can no longer guarantee an independent energy supply. Yeah, sovereigns need independent energy. Europe doesn't have it, and that's the in for Uncle Vlad. Yeah, and that would a currency bloc without sovereignty has to trade way below these levels. Do you think?
100%. There's one other dynamic here, which is China in Europe. And so the relationship between China and Russia is very complicated. So they announced the strategic partnership at the end of the Olympics. And clearly she got some indication he was going after Ukraine and sort of gave him kind of the imprimatur. But it's unclear to a certain extent how much she like had this as part of his own master plan. Because to a certain extent, she and the Chinese were doing really well in Europe. And like, for example, getting the Germans to like slap Lithuania around and getting Germany even into the Chinese sphere of influence. And even some of the like senior British policymakers were saying positive things about China. And so to a certain extent, like you could almost see it as Russia feeling threatened that China was going sort of into their backyard and getting Europe to align with them. And this is like Russia's way to spoil the party, essentially, and to sort of force China back into Russia's orbit, right? So China wants there to be like a new peaceful global order that's like balanced in their view. And there's the Eurasian powers that are dominated by China and its trade routes through BRI, and where Europe is on that sort of European periphery and like the Mackinder model. And, China sits at the center of like a Eurasian tribute system. And then America, yes, a powerful continental power, but is ocean away and is going to have its sphere of influence, is going to have its own trade and economic relationships, but where China is able to essentially get out of the yoke of the dollar system and, kind of exist in this peer equivalence.
And so what the argument that bought into is, hey, we're Russia. Let us take Europe. Then we've got three pillars. We've got the free guys over there. We've got you, like China. You take the east, and we will take the center in Europe.
Yeah, I think in particular Ukraine, it could be you can almost imagine like the presentation, like the pitch is like you need Ukraine's wheat, you need that energy, like you need because China is extremely commodity hungry, and they've been trying to build up their surpluses across their food and their commodity stocks, and so they need stable flows of those commodity resources, and they don't want to be relying on the U.S. Navy to secure those. And so in their mind, if we can they can collectively squeeze the U.S. out of Europe And there's a new security arrangement inside Europe that in particular allows Ukrainian commodities to flow freely to China and, kind of resets the balance of power a bit more in their favor. They go for it. The problem is the Russian military isn't good. And he wasn't able to kind of complete the deal. So I think right now she is in a position of looking at Putin as, it's like that crazy uncle who's like, yeah, on your side, but you want to be dragged into his fights too much because then, you get knocked out, but you kind of have to take a side and it's bad because he's blood, right? Like authoritarians got to stick together kind of thing. And so that's what this kind of this a little bit of a balancing dynamic where she would kind of be fine with a weakened, but, an isolated Russia that's dependent on China, but doesn't want him so weak that he lashes out into something extreme because China does not want there to be this unplanned precipitating crisis in the global dollar system before they're prepared for it. And they're not ready yet, right? Like they're still sending instructions to their party cadre leadership to like slowly divest from overseas assets. To your earlier point, China has a huge, like that recycling mechanism of their domestic savings that they poured into domestic infrastructure that allowed them to build up for the past 20 years. They sort of shifted it and said, oh, we can't really build more bridges and houses, so we're going to relend it now through BRI and spreading, influence there. But there's only so many, safe jurisdictions for you to build a bunch of power plants and bridges and stadiums in Africa and Eurasia. So a lot of that came into the United States into Western equities and Western real estate. So they own, I don't know, my guess is $30 to $50 trillion worth of Western equities and real estate and other assets. It's not obvious that they own it, right? They're taking it from Hong Kong to Cayman Islands to Delaware to Montana, et cetera, right? So it's always, and that was how they did. It was probably not planned initially, but it's maybe slowly now becoming under CCP control. So they have vulnerabilities to the system going through some sort of disjunctive rupture.
They have and tell me, they have thankfully an untested army. The big kind of surprise was the ineffectiveness of, the surprise to those without the knowledge, the ineffectiveness of the initial Russian campaign. What is the expectation in terms of the potency of the Chinese?
There's different views. The people that I trust think that it'd be a mistake to transpose the Russian example to the Chinese. Because one, the Russian stuff is all old. The Chinese stuff is all new. Now, new stuff doesn't mean it's going to work, but the problems the Russians have had with, limited amount of these modern missiles and precision munitions and, poorly trained grunts, et cetera, not all that's going to carry over to the Chinese. In particular, their ships and their missiles are state of the art. In some respects, better than ours. Their hypersonics work. Ours, we just had a failed hypersonic missile test. Our basic naval battle plan is premised on large carrier fleets being protected enough to launch standoff strikes against other Chinese assets. They're investing in much more asymmetric capabilities to launch missiles that have basically an extremely long range to push us out. And basically say, if you want to sail into these waters and contest our blockade of Taiwan, or even just going into the South China Sea and doing something more nuanced and like one of those islands like the Dongyan Islands or the Pratas Island, or doing something more overt with like the Spratlys or the Parcels, we're going to make you risk a carrier. And they have shown they have extremely precise. They've done these tests where these hypersonic missiles come over, these other ballistic missiles come over, and they can hit a moving target at sea, which is extremely difficult to do. The Russians can't do that. And so I think it would be, and that's just like the overt things that they've proven to us. There's a whole other set of capabilities that they have that are, our awareness of which is in the classified space is, they've done a lot to invest in asymmetric capabilities, in particular, like in space. So space would be that's what keeps me up at night is the space stuff, because if you start blowing stuff up in space, you get this thing called the Kessler syndrome, where if you have a destructive anti-satellite attack, it fractures into 1,000 pieces, all those pieces are traveling 25,000 miles an hour. It's like shrapnel that will shred anything in that orbit. And it has this cascading effect where it hits other satellites. And, they did a destructive satellite test 2007. So there's shown like a willingness to do that. And they like for example, Starlink. They wrote a paper that they published. I think they took it down shortly after. Like a military guy wrote it because he was studying how Starlink was being used by the Ukrainian military in Ukraine to basically as like a battlefield communication system, and it's been really effective. Like to do artillery strikes and share drone data and then calculate your targeting. And they're like, well, Starlink, which is Elon Musk's sort of private commercial thing, is now potentially a target of theirs. And now there's this weird dynamic that it's like, now Elon is now brought into the war, right? So I would not underestimate the Chinese military capability. Now, the other thing is they just also have a lot of guys. I think they would also be willing to endure a lot more pain than like the Russians are. They have a major population problem, right? They don't have that many young guys. So like losing a million guys would destroy them. China wouldn't care. In fact, China would probably prefer, like, if there was a report that like a whole bunch of like amphibious landing ships with like thousands of dudes just sank, I don't think China would care at all. In fact, they'd say, right? So like their ability, like, whereas the United States, if we lost a carrier with 3,000 guys, it would be like people would lose their minds.
Well, that's why I think. Continue. Yeah.
Well, that to me is the key asymmetry. Not necessarily even the economic asymmetry, the cyber vulnerabilities, whether our economy is more vulnerable to this, the military balance of power. To me, the ultimate test of a conflict is will to fight, and the psychological control or influence that the military commanders can have on the population to sustain collective national will to engage in, an all-out conflict and endure massive human losses and extreme economic expenditures to achieve your objectives. And China is like, I think their whole system they're building is a system of totalitarian digital control, and they perfected it to a certain extent through COVID to enforce house restrictions and like make people take pain and distribute resources collectively. The United States, again, that's the thing. In a total war, you need to move to a command style economy. That's what we had to do in World War II. You had to have rationing, you had to have capital controls, you had to have state level plans, and you had to basically say, one team, one fight, everyone, we're going to win for democracy. And it's like, well, one system's already there and is indoctrinating their public with like wolf warrior diplomacy, nationalism. They have got a bunch of extra men, and they have a very defined national objective, which is kick the United States out of their backyard, achieve a new balance of power arrangement where they have a sphere of influence. And it's like part of their core national identity is, reunification with their ethnic brethren. The United States doesn't have that story, nor do we have that top-down command, like political and economic culture or institutional framework. We have to build it all on the fly. Maybe we could. We've done it before. We did it in World War II, but I don't know. I look around and I don't see how we would do that.
It's those freedoms that I hope, that make us stronger. So when you talk about the dispensability of like human life in kind of fascist regimes, it does make me think that commerce and the strength of the economy is such a crucial factor. We know this because we have the observation points of the Great Depression, a global economic depression, and how it changed. It made free societies they were willing to sacrifice some of them. They got angry. Yeah. And then with anger came conflict. And again, so when I think Russia, Ukraine, I think for the time being, it's like Russia just kind of wants to keep kicking this dog, Europe, and just like, I'm going to kick it. I'm training it. It's going to come under my domain. And I've got to keep the US out of it just now. And so I'm not going to escalate with the cutting of the internet, etc. China, if I go the other way, what I see is, and what again I worry about is the principal objective in China is the preservation of the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, right? And the economy and the profound change and improvement in lifestyles for all of these dispensable people. Has sustained them. But my fear is because their property market now is $90 trillion, their economy, and they've run out of, they have exhausted the most Looney Tune suboptimal capex programs. They get it, and they kind of don't know what to do next. They need a consumer boom, but again, that has too much freedom implications. So my concern is, if I'm a planner for the CCP, and if I've got an asset capitalist hat on, I'm thinking, we're not doomed, we're not screwed, but we're looking at a Japanese situation of restructuring over several decades, which is going to take us down. And that could take me out politically. So I need a diversion. That's my concern.
I think you're right. I think, and I look at different analysts who, on the one hand, are extremely pessimistic about China, like Peter Zeihan, for example, who basically thinks that they'll cease to be a nation state because the demographic collapse is so severe, it'll just undermine their basic economic model, and it'll just sort of potentially even fracture as a state system. I don't know. That's not my base case, but it's important to calibrate against. On the other hand, I do not think they're going to be this, they're going to topple the United States in terms of the global economic power who can recycle global surpluses and basically recreate a petro/euro yuan system where they slowly internationalize the yuan, open up their capital markets, liberalize, stimulate demand for their sovereign debt, and maybe get some of the OPEC and Eurasian periphery countries to sort of rebalance the flows of their savings instead of into Western capital markets, into Chinese capital markets, and sort of slowly create their own kind of monetary, economic, and trade relationship where they sit at the center of it. That's the optimistic model that they have in their minds, right? Is to sort of, and the key to that success, to your point, they have extreme endogenous weakness, right? The question is, can they? I think part of their vision or their ambition with BRI has been to sort of replicate what we did with developing markets in terms of utilizing the labor arbitrage. Because your point is right. They've somewhat priced themselves out of global manufacturing, and that's why it's all moved to Malaysia and Vietnam, et cetera. But they haven't bootstrapped up the next level of consumer surplus, industries. And so they're kind of stuck in this trap here, and they hope to get through it by technology. That's why they're doing this crash on AI and automation and extreme theft of intellectual property to try to just take all whatever the West is doing and just copy paste it. You can't copy paste human beings though, and they're running out of those, and they don't have the same training that Western people have. So even if they steal the factories, even if they steal the machinery and the IP. It's say build your own indigenous semiconductor capability. You need to have a lot of expertise, and they don't really have that. They're trying to recruit and steal, but they probably don't have enough to replicate what TSMC has. They certainly don't have what the Dutch have with LMS. So they're kind of stuck in this point. The question is, does that force them to do this sort of dramatic geopolitical confrontation to fight the war, and then see what that comes out on the other side, and then use the crucible of the war to reset domestic imbalances. And maybe if they achieve a victory, right? That's the thing. If you win, if they were to play out the scenario, if they were to actively challenge the United States in the South Pacific and win, whatever that means, whether it's we just say, whatever, yours now, we'll give you Diego Garcia, we'll back off, the second island chain and Taiwan's yours. Yes, they still have the demographic issues, but I think then there'd be such a realignment of trade and economic and political relationships throughout the Pacific and to Eurasia, and with OPEC and Europe probably, that I think that could save them. And so to your point, if they're looking for the Hail Mary pass, that would be what they would need, is be to challenge the Western-led order of the United States, decisively beat us, and then reestablish a new pattern. That is a risk, because otherwise, if they keep going, it's not clear they have a good option, right? I think you've had Michael Pettis on. It's they don't have very good options, and the amount of political pain that they need to absorb to say do that rebalancing, raising domestic income, shifting investment, and then building up kind of their own nascent bond market, internationalizing the yuan, using the digital currency initiatives, et cetera, to grease the skids there. That's they're laying the groundwork, but it's just the groundwork. They haven't built it there. They need a bigger
No, I get
So that's
it.
where I do worry there is that raises the chances of a conflict pretty high in the next 2 to 3 years.
I guess we should explain that the delicate or fragile equilibrium that exists between the two great nations today. So what I'm suggesting is that there's an explicit policy by the sovereign leaders of China where where their currency should be appreciating, to my mind. So the renminbi, the Chinese currency versus the dollar, is kind of, let's call it 670. And with its economic advantages, albeit they've been bid away a little bit, like you say, with the tapping labor pools elsewhere in Southern East Asia, but it still exists, and it would typically take you to a kind of renminbi that traded like between 4 and 5, which is to say much stronger. And that would enrich their consumers. You know, like anything you bought overseas would be 30% cheaper. So you'd be wealthier as a citizen, and you'd be rewarded for the productivity that you've brought to the expansion of the sovereign nation. But with that, and with a credit card, you might have a boom-bust cycle, and bust cycles can take out the incumbent leadership. So the CCP say no. So in a world like that, you create surplus savings and you deposit it. The only place that will take it is actually the United States. The only market that's deep enough and it's willing to take the frictional costs of it. And it says, hey, you spend the money. But our problem is it's not America's not in the 19th century. Like savings are not scarce in America. And so we keep applying more. And I want to suggest to you that China's actually operating a war game against the United States, this serfdom notion that by swamping the world with a deliberate economic policy, you are bringing risk-free rates to like zero. And if you reprice risk to zero, then asset prices, again, go to 7 times GDP. And then you can sit back and go, okay, let's change the scenario, because if we go 7 times to 1, boom, everything blows up, you know?
Yeah, no, I have a very similar diagnosis in the sense that China has weaponized the dollar. I don't think it started out that way, but I think ever since Xi came to power in 2013, they fundamentally pivoted their relationship. It used to be they would, net accumulate surpluses in treasuries specifically. Those peaked in 2013, and they shifted to a new model that was essentially BRI plus sort of Western equity and political influence model. And
I don't think it was
the
a
end
new
game
model.
there, because to your point.
Sorry.
Because
The 2013 pivot, I think, was a euro dollar issue. That we like to think their banking system is state run. It's certainly state owned in the majority, but credit works globally on euro dollars, and they've had economic pressure since 2013 to maintain the momentum. And one of those pressures is a kind of dollar collateral issue. And so they own treasuries for collateral for times of stress where they need it. And so I think since 13, the treasury holdings have kind of peaked. And as it runs down, it doesn't reflect, they're not hedge fund managers saying, oh, well, we don't like the dollar here. They're actually saying, we need those dollars to operate our domestic system.
Sorry. So it's like a way of, it works when you have countries that don't have enough endogenous capability to challenge the core with their own instruments of national power. But when you have these sort of quasi-core nations or rising core nations like Russia and China that have developed explicitly instruments to retaliate if the dollar is weaponized against them, right? And that's like the oil weapon, the supply chain weapon, and it's these escalation threats that to take down the global system where West has like sort of quote unquote more to lose than that, right? That's like the game theory of, yes, we'll expose our underbelly, but we know you also have a soft underbelly. And if we get to the point where you're going to engage in a currency war and an economic war, well, we always reserve the right to up the ante into an asymmetric war, into a proxy war, into a cyber war, right? And into a biological war, right? So there's other ways that they could use to, geopolitics. This is where the geopolitics and the trade dynamic comes into play. But to your point about yes, the dollar system is actually starting to work against the national security interests of the United States. I completely agree with that. Because in a sense, yeah, I think Michael Pettis has talked about us maintaining this open capital account, receiving global surplus savings that China has like aggressively flooded the world with because they refuse to do the domestic rebalancing, has forced us, and I think he basically says, either suppress our savings rate, increase household debt, increase public debt. And that's what's happened. And in particular, we had the banking crisis that forced private debts to go into the public debt balance sheet. The way we've tried to, and I've done a lot of trying to like, I'm not an expert in monetary plumbing, but I had developed like an unhealthy obsession with the US Treasury market and like the plumbing of the US Treasury market. And like almost looking at it as like how a doctor would like measure, like the triglycerides in your blood is like, okay, like this is the foundational market of how much all other global markets depend. It also happens to be the sovereign debt market of the global superpower, whose status in that system is being actively challenged by rising states who are engaged in, sub-threshold conflict against it. That foundational market, because of this surplus savings recycling dynamic, has had to grow extremely fast, right, to balance these inflows. And we've had to accumulate more debts, issue more debts, keep the world supplied with dollars, because there's this demand for collateral. So here you go. Here's the collateral. And that works really great, right? And my physics background is like, that's like you have this feedback loop, and everyone sees the feedback loop and sometimes confuses a feedback loop with a network effect. And this is where I think, from my perspective, a lot of the analysis gets mistaken between the status of the dollar as the global currency reserve, the global reserve currency, and the status of the treasury as a global reserve asset. I think the dollar as a unit of account you've exchanged has like true network effects in the sense that the more people that use it, that are willing to use it, means you have more reason to use it, which means more people use it. And so you get this sort of stable equilibrium, right? Like a social network everyone wants to be a part of. A treasury security that we've tried to graft into that network to try to get it to gain from that endogenous network effect of the dollar. But the treasury security itself doesn't have that same stable equilibrium. It has what I would call like a hyperbolic equilibrium, where within a certain domain, it has self-balanced, self-stabilizing effects that are policy, right? We have things like supplementary leverage ratio, we have Basel III, we have a whole bunch of policies that will force private sector balance sheets to absorb treasury issuance. And we've structured the global Eurodollar system to make anyone in the shadow banking system demand treasury collateral if they want to engage in any sort of rehypothecation chain. But that system is not a stable equilibrium, right? Because that system is vulnerable to runs a crisis of confidence where there isn't the lender of last resort yet to backstop all of those counterparty chains of rehypothecated treasury securities.
Isn't that the Fed?
Yeah. Well, that's the Fed's been trying to do that since March 2020 when the off the run market froze and they had to open up these liquidity facilities, swap lines to many more nations, central banks than we originally had.
Couldn't you say they succeeded? There was a moment in March 2020 when the liquidity of the most liquid market, the treasury market, was challenged. And they actually served the purpose of being the lender of last resort. They came in, they said, we will, if you want to sell, China, sovereign, whatever, we're there. We'll buy it. We'll take it off you.
Yeah, and that's why they introduced FIMA, right? Which is specifically geared for China, so that they don't get the tap on the shoulder like they got in 2008 when the Russians came to them, as reported by Paulson, and said, "Hey, let's like hit them when they're down. Let's all fire sell our agency MBS and our treasury securities all at once." And the Chinese were like, "No, like that would hurt us too. So let's not do that." And FIMA is the repo facility, so that they can get dollar liquidity on demand. And so I'm of two minds here. One is, yes, I agree with you that the credibility of the Fed was tested and they came through, right? The question is, if you're making long-term bets, right? So if you're a relative value hedge fund, maybe that's enough because you're fast money and you just need to be able to like get the spread. But if you're a sovereign FX manager and you're making 10, 20-year decisions, do you see that as a stable state? Okay, it worked then, but when's the next crisis going to happen? Is this system look like it's trending in a more stable direction or in a more unstable direction? And for me, it's like the marginal decision-making to hedge against the widening aperture of uncertainty and future risk that gets priced in incrementally as you go forward, that it's like, that's to me is the challenge. Like these band-aids when it comes to the standing repo facility and FIMA, and the size of the responses get larger and larger over time. And so each time the response is big bazooka, wow, we're credible. But then a number of years go by and then it happens again. And I'm like, okay, well, is that the foundation for a global system that's going to be stable for decades? I don't know. And if that's your decision-making time frame, maybe you have to hedge against that system not being stable, against these risks. Like we don't win a power confrontation in the South China Sea, against any of these other tail risks, where we have another pandemic event that forces another $10 trillion in stimulus, right? Where we have to, and if you just look at things that are currently not priced in, but baked in from a policy perspective, we're going to have to finance retirements, boomers, Social Security, Medicare, just big outlays that are just going to be consuming larger portions of our fiscal capacity. We're going to have to.
Well, it's fiat currency, and the Chinese keep sending you the money, so that's fun, albeit that there are serfdom issues.
The question is, where's the marginal bid in 10 years coming from the Treasury market, right? If it's a mix of Japan and relative value hedge funds and financially repressed banks and insurance and pension funds, like you got to measure the size of those balance sheets and how increasing geopolitical volatility is going to maybe shrink them, and whereas you're going to have this push for rearming, reshoring, regreening, all sorts of necessary infrastructure investments and geopolitical defense objectives, but those aren't inherently that productive, right? Like building a new weapon system, employs people, but doesn't make you like a more productive economy. Switching from natural gas to solar and wind, and creates jobs, but the solar and wind just gets you the same joules that you got before. It doesn't generate any more efficient. In fact, it's usually got a lower energy return on investment than your previous infrastructure. And investing in old people, retirements and Social Security, it's social contract. That's part of the deal, but doesn't train the next generation, right? So, like for me, I see a lot of these embedded fiscal obligations in the West that require financing that will not necessarily accrue higher productivity to us. And that seems like a structural problem. Like we need to fix that.
Yeah, it does. So I'm going to go one last dip into the pool, and then let's try like a Q&A where it's just one word answers kind of thing. Then and we'll let you go, Matthew. I'm worried that there's not enough economic intelligence in national security. Like even you're like, God, I wish I knew more about the plumbing, for the Treasury market and the Fed. I maintain there are 5 people in the world who understand money. 5. It's remarkable. It's a cult. It's a mystique. Money. What is it? I fear, again, the thing that I fear is that we're kind of on a gold standard, that we're in the 1920s. The 1920s, the relationship between great sovereign powers was disciplined, or it was conducted via the transfer of gold, physical gold, between these nations. Today, it's not the price of gold or the fluctuations of such. It is the dollar renminbi rate. And I myself and my peers, we see a profound security risk from the weakness of the yen, the Japanese yen. It suddenly had this huge rip where it's got like very weak. And statistically, it's noticeable, it's significant. And that with reflexivity, that can continue. Okay. And if it gets out of hand, I fear, again, from observation, Taiwan in 1997, back in the Asian tiger crisis, I think stretching into 98, Taiwan devalued. Taiwan's always there in these damn conversations. Taiwan devalued, and it was just like, what just happened? Because they had really limited debt in overseas currencies, which would have been a vulnerability. They were running current account surpluses. They were, and it's like, well, why did you do it? Why did the scorpion hit the frog? That's what we do. If the competition just took a 20% price cut on us, we got to match them. Now, I'm saying to you that dollar renminbi should trade kind of like with a 4 handle. Imagine it trades with a 9 or a 10 or a 15 handle, where and effectively what you're doing is you're repricing the Chinese property market from, what is it, like from $90 trillion. And if you change the exchange rate, you bring it down to maybe $40 trillion. Yeah. Now, that is Mad Max. Mm-hmm. A renminbi level at 10 or high, well, with that form of weakness, that is a Mad Max. Everyone's terrified about inflation today, when the biggest risk that I see is that they touch that stone and we go into a hyper deflationary Mad Max world.
Yeah, well, that's where I see it as like we're walking on a ledge that's getting narrower and narrower, and you have like this deflationary cliff on the one hand that is sort of whether from a geopolitical perspective or just the endogenous debt load, like that's pulling you into the deflationary trap. And to like out of fear or in possible response to falling down that, you've got this sort of inflationary policy response on the one hand, right? Just like we need to basically take all those offshore contingent shadow bank liabilities and make them money good on the back of the, fiscal and monetary authorities, right? To basically take what is serving as money, but isn't called money. It's not in the monetary base, but it's the sort of elasticity in the euro dollar system that generates all the economic growth that, eventually shows up is, okay, who's willing to trust their counterparty and, create credit and then create money and then create some money good instrument that can form as collateral. When that is an expansionary mode, money's expanding. When that's in a contractionary mode, it's like, it's not a stable system. It's like, it just collapses unless there's someone who has the ability to reflate it and make those claims money good. That's why I see all these, like, that's why I look at the treasury plumbing as like attempts to try to, protect at least some part of that credit market that's like strategically important, which is the U.S. Treasury security market, to make sure that any disruption doesn't come and bite the Uncle Sam in the butt. But there's lots of other sovereign debt out there that's also subject to that like latent deflationary collapse. And the question is, well, if we have to back that up, if we have to put that on our balance sheet, we have to put the Eurodollar system on the back of the Fed, what's the size of the Fed's balance sheet there, right? So that's, to me, is like you get this deflationary collapse that either leads to, just complete Mad Max scenario, but I don't think policymakers politically would allow that, right? They would just say, right, we have to make it all money good. Moral hazard be damned. And I think this is a scenario where you could see the geopolitical angle come in there, which is like swap lines for friends only. Japan, we will bail you out. We will basically backstop all of your debts to a certain extent. We'll buy your bonds or whatever it ends up being. But you're ours now. You're just like, we're just, like we just make more semi-formal the fact that you're now just like a proxy state for the United States, right? And that's like, in a sense, the obligation of the dollar being the king dollar, being the steward of this global dollar system that has this dynamic effect on every other nation, like has that political obligation in a sense. But yeah, it brings you into these domains of potential conflict where China has this, button they can press and blow everything up. And yeah, that's not a safe place to be. It does worry me.
Not a safe place. And it's 50-50 and it's not a safe place, which is scary. Listen, Matthew, you've been unbelievably kind and generous and fascinating. Can we do like 5 or 6 kind of like rapid fire, like just fine?
I can roll.
Your mind, you're like, oh, give me it. Yeah. So, Russia-Ukraine conflict unresolved in 3 years' time? Yes, no?
Unresolved meaning like
still ongoing?
Yes.
No. So that would just, I'm assuming, therefore, you do not see a putsch. You don't see Putin being taken out.
I think he's more likely to die of his cancer. But even then, I think his replacement wouldn't change much. But yeah, I think it'll be a frozen conflict. It'll just be, because it's like an open wound. As long as it doesn't cost them too much, which I don't think it will be, to like keep the front intact whenever they, get to the south and have control over the Azov and enough of the southern coast, then yeah, freezing the conflict, and then every once in a while when it suits their need to flare it back up again. Yeah, I see. Unless yeah, I see no reason for it to like reach a permanent resolution.
Well, that's more than a yes, but I will give you that.
Yes,
China,
I'll keep it simple.
China invades Taiwan next 3 years.
Yes, although I think it won't be a traditional invasion, but it will be a armed attempt to change the status quo. I'll say that.
Well, is the Fed a threat to national security?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I mean, I'd say no, because I think that them personally are not a threat. The system that they run is a threat.
Does oil trade $200 or $50, given the geopolitical, in the next 3 years?
Oh, I think it's much more likely to be 200.
Okay. Stock market crashes next 3 years?
I mean, I think there will be a crash. I mean, slow motion, but no, I actually think equities do reasonably well because that's where people will want to put their safe assets.
And so I just said, how did I make this? Yes, no. My career was always about rejecting expert advice because I needed crazy people. Not all. I mean, I work with straight smart people, but the crazy people always got my juices going. So I'm trying to think, what is the craziest scenario that one could like? What is the WTF? Like, who would have thought that? You know, like, is it Russia wins Ukraine? It becomes the controller of Europe, and then Russia is taken out by China.
If you want to hear what I think is actually the most, and it's going to be a complete wild card. It's actually going to be related to those flying things that the U.S. government is now becoming more serious about.
UFOs?
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a much more serious topic in the next few years.
Okay. Are those drones carrying Bitcoin?
I mean, probably not. We didn't get into Bitcoin. That'd be a whole other conversation. But yeah, I mean, no. I mean, it's a subject that is taboo and fringy, but I'll just say it's being taken extremely seriously by U.S. Defense Department and the intelligence community, and is now being examined. There's legislation that's been passed. There's going to be more legislation. There's going to be some more congressional hearings. It's going to become more of a larger topic. And so if you're saying for like, what's the outside super crazy tail risk scenario that would have like market shaking geopolitical, human identity implications, that would be the one I'd pick out of the rabbit hole.
Are we discussing Bitcoin or aliens?
Aliens.
Oh, aliens, right? Okay.
The Bitcoin thing
it could apply to both. It could be both. But
exactly.
Yeah.
We'll have the Bitcoin alien conversation next.
Yeah. Do you think the UFO thing, because it seems orchestrated, it seems deliberate, it seems planned, is it some form of foil or disguise for technological defense innovation that they now need to kind of leak to say, actually, don't do it? Like if we've got a carrier and it's out there in Asia, and you're feeling confident of like being able to hit us at sea, like don't do it. Because look what the UFOs can do.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what I can say. So I think that's part of it. It's not the whole story though. There's an element to that, possibly, but I think it's also a lot weirder than that. It's not just that. Two last
questions. One last question. What are you more confident in? The revelation that aliens exist, or Bitcoin hits 100,000 in the next 3 years?
Bitcoin by a hair.
Wonderful. Listen, that was mind-blowing, Matthew. That's what we need on the asset capitalists. It's a pity that the alchemist, Chris Sweeney, couldn't be here. I would love to have seen his processing for today. I'm sure he'd be fascinated by the UFOs. I'm going to let you go, but before I do so, can I just put a message out again, a message of love, a message of thanks, because I have been begging the tribe to leave us some, you understand this, Matthew, to leave us, we've got a hack on the Apple podcast. We think we can nudge it. We think if we can get to 1,000 reviews, that the system goes, oh, let's do some asset capitalism, yeah? And I've gone from 40 to, I think, 109 reviews. I had 40 over 2 years, and we've had that incremental gain in the last 2 weeks. So people, so much thank you. We'll put instruction on the YouTube page again, but contact at upsandpartners.com, I believe. And if you continue to kind of make comments, if you can paste them and send them to that address, then we'll do the legwork. And I'm very close to the hat thing now. And if you do that, if you send your screenshot, I've got 3 hats, like this one, I've got an asset capitalist one, and I've got a black one, and three unfortunate victims will be sent those hats. So Matthew, thank you very much. Thank you. And we'll have you back on again. People, don't forget, he's out there. Matthew, how do people find you?
Sure, yeah, hit me up on Twitter at Matthew_Pines. DMs are open. Looking to engage in any witty repartee or send some interesting stuff my way.
Wonderful. We'll let you go. We're finished, people. It's over. Until next week.
Thank you.
I think we're done.